First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this particular meeting for enticing me to come to the Faroes. I was born and bred and raised, and I will die on the island of Newfoundland. And it only took about 20 minutes of standing on this rock and breathing the air and seeing the sheep on the mountainsides and looking at the boats to recognize that I had come to a place with which undoubtedly I shared with them and they shared with me a great deal in common. Despite the debates around the world which seem to focus on the great voices that tumble out of the massive urban centers of the countries around the world, there is a vast community of human beings that make their way, their livelihoods, by dealing directly with nature in ways they have done historically and through time, and in ways that largely represent both the evolutionary and the historical connections that we as one animal on this planet have had and shared with all other species that inhabit the same world. The request made to me today is to talk about the issue of wild animals as a food source in general, and therefore my presentation will not necessarily focus so much on marine mammals, because that is a level of expertise that other people in this conference have to an extent much greater than my own. My primary background deals with the study, research, and the harvest of terrestrial wildlife, but of course you cannot come from a place like the island of Newfoundland and not be aware of our deep global dependence on the oceans and all that the oceans provide. In the history of humanity, the consumption of wild meat obviously has been something that has been integral to our existence. We know, in fact, that it was as the human form, our present form of human, and some related forms, moved more in the direction of the consumption of wild meat, that massive physiological, intellectual, morphological, and social changes took place. This is in part, of course, because of the compactness of the nutrition in wild meat, and also the bioavailability of the nutrients and minerals that are stored there. The consumption of meat has been something that the human animal has been adapted to for a very, very long period of time. And you are all in this room, reflections of that close association and all the talents and capacities that you may have, in part and significantly have derived from the consumption of wild meat through historical and particularly evolutionary time. Human survival and cultural and economic development have always been closely associated with the biological resources of the planet, of course. And while the intensity of these uses has changed over time, especially with the cultural transformations that continue to occur, there is no doubt that there remains an incredible dependence on wild species for our very survival. From a food perspective, that is obviously true, and that was demonstrated in the earlier presentations which have talked about the importance of foods from the sea, in particular, in feeding the world's global population. Marine mammals and the marine systems have figured prominently in this long journey of humanity, 70,000 years out of Africa, encircling the globe, and in almost every instance where it was possible, taking advantage of the extraordinarily rich environments that the ocean world provides. It is an interesting time to have this conference, an interesting time to be discussing these issues, because as there are many debates surrounding them, as we will come to a little bit later in the presentation, we also see that there are some startling statistics facing the world's human population. And statistics, you know, are very interesting things because they're cold, they're rigid, they're like concrete or rock or cement. And they often don't convey to people what really is behind it. But if you look at some of the metrics that have been applied here, you get some idea of just how severe the problems of food security are on this planet currently facing the global population of human beings, of all races, of all religions, of all skin colors, of all kinds. We have one natural world, we have one humanity, and we have one chance to do the right thing for all. But you look at these statistics, and you think that 45 million children under the age of 5 suffer from wasting disease. They could be your children, they could be mine, they are undoubtedly someone's. They are loved. They are missed. They are cried over. The statistics are just what we compile to hopefully convince people that we have a problem worth addressing. Secure access to good quality food is an absolute necessity for human well-being. There is no replacement, there is no alternative equation, there is no other scenario. It's a very simple, concrete truth that needs to be accepted by global policymakers, local communities, the general public, and all human beings who care to think about such matters. It is easy enough to think that everyone goes to the grocery store today to buy their wild food or their foods of any kind. But in fact, wild food, and wild meat in particular, remains crucial to the food security of millions and millions of people. It is true that today many people feel disconnected from the natural world. It is true almost everywhere that fewer and fewer people participate directly in the harvest, the killing, the butchering, the preparation, and the consumption of food themselves, and that they journey to other places, restaurants or grocery stores or whatever it might be, to acquire what they wish to consume. But what they consume is produced in natural systems somewhere, and how that food is produced in those natural systems somewhere affect every single one of us in this room, and our choices about the food we consume affect further the future options and choices that we will have. Wild meat and fish tend to represent the main sources of protein, fat, and micronutrients for rural people around the world. And in many remote communities, it can amount to as much as 80%. I live on the island of Newfoundland. I can assure you that in every rural community where I live, still to this day, 2022, that the vast majority of the wild food, the wild meat in particular, the meat in particular that is consumed is wild meat that is harvested by the people themselves. Moose, caribou, black bear, sea ducks, other seabirds. Without that food, would they all starve, ladies and gentlemen? No, they would not all starve. But without that food, the food economy in their homes and the quality of the food that they consume, because wild meat is so nutritious, would decline. These are not wealthy people. These are not people who control the levers of government and the levers of economies. They do not have the great influence, just like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions and billions of other people who live on this planet with us. Nevertheless, the fact that this wild meat is available to them and they can harvest it and they know how to harvest it they are able to do this for themselves, is what enables those very cultures to remain and to exist. We have a word called biodiversity that the world seems to be in love with. I am not a particularly large fan of the word biodiversity because it has left out the human element from the very beginning. It is all about the other wild others and not about the human animal. Well, I think we need to think about the human animal, just as we think about the jaguar or the elephant or the rhino or some other species that we seem to have great love for. We ought to be thinking about this particular animal and how we make our way and how we feed ourselves. And we need to be doing it in a way that considers the great complexity of this whole idea of how are we going to feed the billions of us. Bear in mind, when we come to this issue of meat overall, there are these discussions and developments about trends towards vegetarianism and other kinds of ways of living, totally appropriate for the people who wish to do it. The truth of the matter, however, is that between 1998 and 2018, global meat consumption increased by 58%. And global meat consumption continues to increase in countries all over the world, of diverse culture, of diverse background, and the trends are likely to continue. We might also remind ourselves, in this context of whether we will harvest, whether it's marine mammals from the sea, or whether it is terrestrial mammals on land, or reptiles, or amphibians, or insects, or birds, we might also remind ourselves that each year on this planet, 72 billion domestic animals are butchered to feed us meat. They too live, breathe, have emotions, feel pain, have offspring, but they die to feed us. The question of how much wild meat is being eaten is sometimes very difficult to assess. That's because there are not that many studies that go into all regions of the world to actually examine this particular question. What we do know is that we harvest an enormous diversity of species. In the case of various studies that have been developed, we know that over 2,000 species of invertebrates, amphibians, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals are used as wild meat in every sense across the world. We know that the species that are harvested vary over time and over place because rural people harvest that which is available to them. What they harvest in South Africa is different from what they harvest in North America or in Europe. But the truth of the matter is that massive amounts of harvests are occurring in many, many regions of the world of wild meat still, and it is wild meat for consumption by people, by families, by communities, where not only is the nutritional demands satisfied, but also it turns the wheels of their small economies within their families and their small communities. It would be a mistake to think that we have decided that only a small component of wildlife resources, of wildlife species, are to be utilized in this regard. In Central and South America, for example, primate species are one of the primary targets for wild meat consumption. In other parts of the world, insects are used much more heavily, mostly the pupae and the rich, fat-rich sources coming from the hundreds of species of insects that are harvested around the world. All of these things are meant to show that it is not a small, isolated phenomenon that we still, on this planet, as human beings, harvest significant amounts of wild meat from nature. This is not a small, secluded phenomenon for something like the Faroe Islands. It is not something that simply happens on the island of Newfoundland or happens in some other country distant from here. This is happening on virtually all continents everywhere. That substantive harvest of wild, living animals are a deep, integral part of the economies and livelihoods of billions of people on this planet. And I say that their lives are as equal to any lives in the human population. That their cultures are equal to any culture of the human population. That their perspectives, rights, and desires are equal to those of any others in the human population anywhere in the world. The harvest of wild meat is absolutely no sideshow. I talked a little earlier about the difficulty of establishing the real trends in what's happening with respect to wild meat harvest, and that is because there has been a predominant tendency in international organizations around the world to focus upon tropical and subtropical regions when assessing this issue. There have been many reasons for this. I won't go into them all, but one of those is that, of course, in these regions, the harvest of wild animals for wild food, which is very common, has led to what we consider to be the bushmeat crisis, as it is termed. This is a circumstance where, because of the large numbers of people with few options who harvest wildlife for their consumption and for small-scale economies, because they deserve an economy too, yes, leads in many cases to overexploitation of the wildlife in those regions. This, of course, has a negative biodiversity impact, but it also ultimately affects their ability to feed themselves and to build their own economies in this maddening circle of circumstances. This is something the world is very concerned about, because the world is very concerned about biodiversity. What they mean by being concerned about biodiversity is about being concerned about the animals, not so much about the human populations that live in those circumstances and rely on those animal populations. However, this is changing. This is changing. We have managed to convince, a group of us, have managed to convince the Convention on Biodiversity that they should now examine, and they are willing to do so, examine wild meat harvest in other regions of the world, particularly temperate regions, non-tropical, non-subtropical regions of the world, opening up opportunities for organizations and countries of all kinds to be able to bring their stories forward into one of the most influential international conventions we have, the Convention on Biodiversity. I raise things like this in this lecture to suggest that there are opportunities that we may have not yet followed, opportunities that we might seize if we are aware of their existence and have the willingness to apply our own ingenuity, our own organizations in pursuit of those opportunities. If we do not pursue them, then we should not in 10 or 15 years lament and say we never had a chance and an opportunity to do so. This refers, by the way, the opportunity to look at other regions, to places like Canada and the United States, not often thought about as places where people harvest large amounts of wild food to make their living. 40 million people in Canada and the United States every single year, 40 million every single year, hunt and fish recreationally. And one of the primary motivations of that is to secure wild, harvested food for their personal consumption and for the sharing with their friends. I might also say that that process has been one of the leading reasons for the conservation achievements in North America itself. So we have seized on these opportunities. My organization, Conservation Visions, in association with SULI, the Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group of the IUCN, we have launched a major study to evaluate just how much wild meat and fish and eventually berries and medicinal plants and nuts and maple syrup and all these other products from nature, just how much of this is still being utilized by people in two very wealthy Western democracies that much of the world perhaps might suspect do not have these large-scale interventions in wild meat food harvesting. Believe you me, if you come to the United States of America and many parts of Canada, you will see cultures that are entirely devoted to procuring for themselves their own source of wild meat and food. These wild meat harvests in North America are very significant. I just want to show you this one data point here. This is what, in just a very simple calculation of what's being made available in Canada and the United States annually through this recreational hunting harvest, 1.5 billion meals a year based on a 6-ounce serving is being provided through these activities in these two countries. I could give you the breakdown by species, but that is not so important. The case study of the Newfoundland seal hunt, of course, brings out another aspect of this issue of wild meat harvests. The controversies that can lead us to rather strange circumstances where we can have almost 8 million of these seals in our waters and yet have decisions made in a distant part of the world from us, the EU, which essentially makes it impossible for us since 2009 to really effectively harvest and market seals that have long played a major role for the lifestyles, communities, and food security of people who have lived on the island of Newfoundland for 500 years and more. It is not as though we don't need additional food. You see how the world population is increasing. You see, for example, that to meet the demands of the growing human population, we have converted 1 million square kilometers of wild land to agriculture since 1960. As we do that, we destroy biodiversity, ladies and gentlemen. We don't enhance it. And yet often, what we are raising there goes to feed, about 50% of it goes to feed domestic animals that then contribute back to many of the problems we have with climate change, etc., in the world today. Biodiversity and food security are deeply, deeply interrelated. We know this, of course, and we also know that the biodiversity challenges on the planet have been enormous, and we know that they continue to escalate, which means we have a great problem in trying to figure out how to develop sustainable practices for the harvest of wild meat and foods. Just a brief comment to say that wild meat and livelihoods go together, and livelihoods are not all about food. Livelihoods are about a sense of identity. Livelihoods are about culture. Livelihoods are about many, many dimensions that make a people, give a people a sense of identity of who they are, of what their place in the world is. And for those peoples, those billions of peoples who still rely on wild meat for that part of their livelihoods and expression, this is a critically, absolutely critically important component of this idea of wild meat harvesting. Oh. Not sure if our little machine is, there we go. Oh. We have many challenges to wild meat harvests in the world, as you can see. All of these factors have to be considered when we're trying to develop sustainable policies for wild meat harvests around the world. But we also have organizations that are working very deliberately to develop sustainable wildlife management practices for the harvest of wild species around the world. And we know, in fact, that it is entirely possible to develop ecologically sound and economically sound wildlife management programs that benefit both people and nature in this context. There is a clear demand for institutions like this one that are involved in policy discussions and many others to recognize that there is now a growing demand to enshrine the sustainable use of wildlife in international conventions. This is an opportunity that did not express itself, did not exist years ago, and it is something that has changed the playing field substantially. When the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention on Migratory Species, the International Commission on the Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, when the IUCN itself, when the group I represent, SULI, are all fighting for this and bringing these ideas into the conventions that are signed by world governments, this opens up an opportunity for us to have greater impact. And just to sum up, the group that I lead, or I help to lead, the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, this is a group that is dedicated within the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, to actually work explicitly on these ideas of sustainable use of wild living resources and the building of human economies and developing the policies and programs that are necessary to make these things work. Every one of you in this room, every person in NAMMCO, ought to be thinking about joining in some way with this effort. We are speaking all over the world with respect to these kinds of ideas, these kinds of motivations, these kinds of important things. And we are very much bringing to the world this idea that local voices matter. The diversity of human culture on this planet remains extraordinary. And that diversity is worth protecting in its own right. I only have to step here on these islands to have a sense that this must be maintained, it must be protected, and the traditions of the people here must be listened to. They must be known, they must be respected. And this is true across the world. How else otherwise do we build a human economy that will be effective? People have the right to sustainably use, manage, and benefit from the local resources that they have. It is easy for people who live in distant places to try to explain to those who live far away that they should change the way they live. It is very easy for the people in New York City to tell the people in South and Eastern Africa that they should learn to live with marauding lions and elephants, while they themselves, if they see so much as a cockroach, immediately in panic call someone to remove it from their homes. It is very easy to condemn the traditions of people elsewhere who have lived by those traditions for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It is easy to take the seal hunt from the Newfoundlanders because we were few. We did not have the levers of power, and that could be taken from us. Meanwhile, 8 million harp seals, beautiful animals, swim our waters and collectively consume more fish than the entire production that comes out of that region of the Northwest Atlantic currently. I am not saying that seals don't deserve fish. They must have fish. They must have fish to become seals. But what I am saying is it's time for places like this, the world over, to unite and to realize that there are growing institutional acceptances, sensitivities, and openness to having these kinds of discussions. This is not 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it is today. And I personally believe we have a much better fighting chance today than we have ever had before to maintain these special, precious identities and to sustainably utilize the wild living resources of this planet. Thank you very much.